The Haunting of Hollow Ridge. Episode 10, The Cycle Restarts. The walk out of the forest felt surreal to Nina, Daniel, Jack, Tom, and Grace. For the first time since they had entered Hollow Ridge, the air felt lighter. The tension that had gripped their hearts was fading, and the sun rose above the horizon, casting a warm glow across the sky. "We did it," Grace whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "We did it." Nina nodded, though her mind still reeled from everything that had happened. They had faced their worst fears, stood against the dark force that had been feeding off them, and won. The figure in the shadows was gone, and the house had collapsed into ruins. They were free. But something didn't sit right with her. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the lingering effects of their ordeal. It was a deep, gnawing sense that they weren't entirely done with Hollow Ridge. A feeling that clung to her as they made their way out of the woods and back to the world they had almost forgotten existed. As the group walked through the overgrown path, Daniel broke the silence. "We should call someone when we get back. Tell them what happened." Tom scoffed. "And say what? That we got trapped in a haunted house that tried to kill us? They'll think we're crazy, but we know it's real," Nina said quietly. "And we need to make sure no one else goes through this." They continued walking, their footsteps heavy, but as the trees began to thin and the road leading back to civilization came into view, the strangest sensation washed over them all. Something was off, familiar, yet wrong. Grace paused, her brow furrowed. "Wait, we've been here before." The others stopped, glancing around. The road ahead of them, the trees, the faint distant outline of buildings, it all seemed eerily familiar, but not in the way it should have been. "It's the same road," Jack muttered, his voice tight. "The same road we walked down when we first got here." "That's impossible," Daniel said, shaking his head. "We're headed away from the house. We've been walking for hours." But Nina knew he was wrong. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. "It's happening again," she whispered. Tom turned to her, confusion and panic flashing in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "The cycle," Nina said, her voice shaking. "It's restarting. The house, it's not done with us." Before anyone could react, the world around them began to shift. The air grew colder, the trees around them twisted into grotesque shapes, and the road beneath their feet seemed to ripple like water. The sky darkened, the sun disappearing behind thick, unnatural clouds, plunging them back into the same nightmarish atmosphere they thought they had escaped. "No," Grace whispered, stepping back in horror. "This can't be happening. We got out." But there was no mistaking it. The feeling of dread, the oppressive weight, they were back in Hollow Ridge. The house might have crumbled, but its curse had latched onto them, dragging them into a cycle they couldn't break. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed through the trees, soft but clear. "You cannot leave." Nina's blood ran cold. The voice was the same, smooth, sinister, and all too familiar. The figure in the shadows wasn't gone. It had never truly been defeated. "You are part of this now," the voice continued, as the world twisted further around them, the road stretching into infinity. "You thought you could destroy me, but I live in your fears, in your regrets. And now, you belong to me." The group turned in every direction, searching for a way out, but the trees around them seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The road behind them dissolved into the fog, cutting off any hope of escape. "Run!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Grace's hand and pulling her forward. But as they ran, the ground beneath them warped and shifted. No matter how far or how fast they moved, the landscape around them remained the same. They were trapped in an endless loop, running but never getting anywhere. Nina's heart pounded in her chest. The truth was sinking in, there was no way out. The house, the curse, the dark force that had haunted them, it was eternal. It had never been about the building itself. It was about them. "This isn't real," Nina screamed, trying to force her mind to wake from the nightmare. "We're not going to let you control us." But the voice only laughed, cold and mocking. "You've already lost." The moment you stepped into Hollow Ridge, you became mine. And no matter how hard you fight, no matter how far you run, you will always end up back here." The ground beneath Nina's feet gave way, and she fell, tumbling into a dark void. She could hear the others screaming, but their voices were distant, as if she was being pulled further and further away from them. When she finally hit the ground, she gasped for air, her body aching. Slowly, she opened her eyes, and found herself lying on the cold, stone floor of Hollow Ridge. The house had reformed around her, the walls and ceilings as solid as they had been when they first arrived. She wasn't alone. The figure stood before her, its eyes glowing in the dim light. It reached out a hand, and Nina felt the cold grip of terror wrap around her heart. "This is where you belong," the figure whispered. "Forever." As the darkness closed in, Nina's final thought was one of despair. They hadn't escaped. They never would. End of episode 10.